Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. Spring of 2017, I'd just gotten my permanent ranger position after bouncing between seasonal jobs since finishing my environmental science degree. Cedar Falls National Park sprawled across 300,000 acres of wilderness, and I was responsible for the northern sector, the most remote part where cell service died after the first ridge. Most days I dealt with lost hikers, illegal campfires, or the occasional bear that got too comfortable around the backcountry sites. That Wednesday in May started like any other: coffee in my thermos, radio check with dispatch, and a maintenance run to check trail conditions after the spring melt. Around noon, dispatch crackled through about a hiker complaint near Wolverine Ravine, something about a smell bad enough to make them turn back from their planned route. Wolverine Ravine sat 8 miles from the nearest trailhead, down a series of switchbacks that dropped 2,000 feet through dense pine forest. The hiker who called it in was this retired chemistry teacher named Harold, the type who logged every mile in a notebook and knew the park better than some rangers. When Harold said something was wrong, you listened. I grabbed my pack, extra water, and started the hike in, figuring maybe an elk had died near the trail or someone had left food that attracted scavengers. The temperature hit 75 that day, warm enough that any dead animal would definitely make its presence known. By the time I reached the ravine entrance, sweat soaked through my uniform shirt and gnats swarmed around my face. But nothing prepared me for the wall of stench that hit when the wind shifted. Death has this particular smell that gets into your throat and stays there, and this was definitely death, but mixed with something chemical like old motor oil and ammonia. I pulled my shirt up over my nose and followed the smell off the main trail, pushing through manzanita bushes that scratched my arms even through the long sleeves. About 40 feet down the ravine's steep slope, wedged between 2 boulders and partially covered with branches that someone had clearly arranged on purpose, I found her. Female, maybe mid-30s based on the clothing style, though decomposition made it hard to tell much else. What struck me immediately wasn't just finding a body. We'd had deaths in the park before, heart attacks on trails, climbing accidents, even a suicide 2 years back. What made my skin prickle was the location. This spot was impossible to reach without serious rock climbing skills, the kind that required ropes and anchors, and she was wearing jeans and running shoes, not hiking gear. I radioed dispatch for backup and the coroner, gave them GPS coordinates, then started documenting everything with my phone camera while waiting. The branches covering her had been cut with something sharp, not broken naturally, and arranged in this deliberate crisscross pattern. Her wrists showed ligature marks even through the decay, and there was duct tape residue on what remained of her jacket. But the detail that really got me was her jewelry, a distinctive turquoise bracelet with silver feather charms that looked handmade, expensive, definitely not something you'd wear hiking. I spent the next hour searching the immediate area for any trail evidence, footprints, torn clothing, anything that might explain how she got here. The only access was this near-vertical rock chute that even experienced climbers in our rescue team avoided. Someone had carried or lowered her body down here, and that someone knew exactly what they were doing, knew this spot would never be checked during regular patrols. The coroner, Dr. Melissa Huang, arrived 3 hours later with the sheriff's department. While they worked to extract the body, she pulled me aside with this grim expression I'd never seen on her before. The victim matched a missing person report from 6 months earlier, a woman named Angela Reeves from Millbrook, the town about 90 miles east of the park. Angela had disappeared after leaving a bar one Friday night. Security footage showed her getting into her car alone, then nothing. Her car was found abandoned on Highway 89 2 days later, but that was still 60 miles from where we stood now. Dr. Huang said Angela had never been reported as a park visitor, never bought a permit, never appeared on any trail cameras. Someone had driven her body here specifically to dump it, choosing the most remote section of the park miles from any established trail, in a spot that would have taken serious planning to access. Sheriff's deputy named Kevin Ortiz took over the scene, and he immediately started asking me questions that made it clear this wasn't the first body dump they'd dealt with. Had I noticed any vehicles parked at unusual times at the remote trailheads? Any tire tracks on closed service roads? Anyone asking about abandoned mine shafts or caves in the area? He mentioned 2 other bodies found in national forests within a 200-mile radius over the past 18 months, both women from different towns, both discovered in nearly inaccessible locations. When I asked if they thought it was a serial killer, Kevin shook his head and said it was worse than that. These were disposal sites for something bigger, criminal organizations using federal lands because local cops had no jurisdiction and federal agencies were stretched too thin. The wilderness was perfect for them, millions of acres where a body might never be found, where even if someone stumbled across remains, the evidence would be degraded beyond usefulness. I couldn't get Angela Reeves out of my head that night, kept thinking about her family searching for 6 months while she was rotting in my park. The next morning, I started my own investigation, pulling up satellite maps of the northern sector, marking every possible vehicle access point that wasn't on official park maps. There were dozens of old logging roads from the 70s, most supposedly gated off, but gates could be cut. I spent my next 3 days off hiking these forgotten roads, and on the second day, found fresh tire tracks on what should have been an abandoned fire road near Granite Peak. The tracks led to a cleared area hidden by thick pine cover where someone had definitely been parking regularly. Cigarette butts and energy drink cans scattered around, fresh ones on top of weathered ones. From that spot, it was a 2-mile hike to another ravine system, even more remote than where we'd found Angela. I marked the coordinates and kept going. The second ravine made me wish I'd brought a weapon. About 300 yards in, the smell hit again, that same mix of decomposition and chemicals. This time I found 3 of them, different stages of decay, all women, all showing signs of violence, all carefully positioned in natural depressions and covered with branches in that same crisscross pattern. One still had blonde hair visible, synthetic extensions that hadn't decomposed, and a tattoo on her ankle of a butterfly with the name Sophia underneath. Another wore a medical alert bracelet for diabetes. The third was mostly bones, but the skull showed dental work, expensive veneers that someone would have records of. I took photos of everything, my hands trembling so bad I had to retake half of them. These weren't random victims. These were people with families, jobs, medical histories, women who'd been erased from their communities and hidden in mine. I called Kevin directly instead of going through dispatch. Figured the fewer people who knew about this, the better, until we understood what we were dealing with. He brought a full forensics team and 2 FBI agents who'd been investigating similar dumps in Nevada and Utah. Agent Diana Price, this woman with sharp gray eyes who looked like she hadn't slept in weeks, told me I'd found what they'd been searching for, the primary disposal site for a trafficking ring that operated along the Interstate 80 corridor. They moved women between cities for forced prostitution, and when someone became too much trouble, got too sick or tried to escape, they ended up here. The chemical smell I'd noticed was industrial lime, used to accelerate decomposition and destroy DNA evidence. They'd been using my park for at least 2 years based on the decay rates, maybe longer. Diana said the people running this had to have someone local, someone who knew the park's patrol schedules, the seasonal patterns, when areas would be completely deserted. That comment about someone local made me think about every interaction I'd had differently. The contractors who maintained the remote facilities, the seasonal workers who came and went, even some of my fellow rangers who always volunteered for the cushier assignments near the visitor center. I started carrying my service weapon even on routine patrols, double-checking my truck for tampering each morning, varying my route so no one could predict where I'd be. A week after the FBI removed the bodies, I was checking the northern boundary fence when I found something that confirmed my paranoia was justified. Fresh boot prints led to a tree where someone had installed a trail camera, one of those high-end models hunters use, positioned to watch the old fire road I'd discovered. The memory card was missing, but the camera was still warm, meaning someone had been here within the hour, watching me investigate, documenting my movements. The warning started small, but got progressively worse over the next 2 weeks. First, I found branches arranged in an arrow pattern pointing away from the ravine areas, laid out deliberately across the trail I used for morning patrols. Then someone slashed my personal truck's rear tire while it was parked at my cabin inside the park, even though the residential area was supposed to be secure, accessed only by employees with key cards. They wanted me to know they could reach me anywhere. The third warning came when I was returning from a night patrol and found fresh vehicle tracks in my driveway, circling my cabin 3 times, the driver never getting out, just circling and leaving. The tracks were from heavy tires, the kind on commercial trucks, and they'd been careful to stay on the gravel where individual tread patterns wouldn't show clearly. But the message was obvious. They knew where I lived, knew when I wasn't home, knew my schedule well enough to leave their calling card without being caught. The final warning was the one that made me request an immediate transfer. I woke up at 3 in the morning to my dog going absolutely crazy, barking and snarling at the bedroom window. When I looked out, there was a single work glove placed on my truck's side mirror, the exact same brand our park maintenance crew used, still damp with what looked like blood but turned out to be transmission fluid when I had it tested later. Attached to the glove with a zip tie was a photo printed on regular paper, grainy but clear enough to see it was me at the second ravine, taking pictures of the bodies. Someone had been watching that entire time, close enough to photograph me but hidden well enough that I never knew they were there. On the back of the photo, someone had written a single line in block letters: "Rangers who get lost, stay lost." I packed that night, called Agent Price, and was in protective custody by dawn while the FBI took over the investigation. 6 months later, they arrested 14 people, including 2 park maintenance workers and a county sheriff's detective who'd been feeding the trafficking ring information about investigations. The maintenance guys, brothers named Robert and James Novak, had been using their access to scout disposal sites and monitor ranger patrol patterns for 3 years. They'd even helped search for missing hikers a few times, knowing exactly where the bodies were because they'd put them there. The detective, a 20-year veteran everyone respected, had been taking payments to misdirect missing person cases and warn the ring when agencies got too close. They found 17 more bodies across 3 states using information from the arrests. But what haunts me most is what Agent Price told me during the trial. They estimated at least 30 more victims were still out there, hidden in places so remote they might never be found. Women whose families would never get closure. I work at a state park in Michigan now. Nice, safe place with manicured trails and families having picnics. Nothing like the vast wilderness of Cedar Falls. But sometimes I still wake up at 3 in the morning, expecting to see something on my truck mirror. Still check for tire tracks in my driveway. Still get nervous when I see branches arranged in any kind of pattern. The FBI said the trafficking ring is dismantled. The killers are serving life sentences. The park is safe again. Maybe that's true, but I know there are other remote places, other parks with hundreds of thousands of acres where nobody goes, other maintenance workers with keys to every gate. I know because Agent Price calls me sometimes, asks if I remember specific details about the terrain, the access roads, the way the bodies were positioned. She's still looking for those 30 women, still finding new disposal sites, still discovering how deep this network went. The wilderness that I once loved for its isolation now feels like a massive crime scene, and I can't shake the feeling that we only found what they wanted us to find, that the really remote places, the ones even rangers don't patrol, are hiding worse secrets. June in the mountains meant wildfire season, and somebody had to staff the remote observation posts. After 12 years with the Forest Service, rotating through the backcountry stations had become routine for me. Pine Ridge Cabin sat 14 miles from the nearest paved road, accessible only by a narrow dirt track that switchbacked through dense forest. Most rangers hated the isolation, especially the night shifts. but I actually preferred them. The silence gave me time to catch up on paperwork, monitor the radio channels, and watch for any signs of smoke on the horizon. That particular evening started like any other. I'd driven up just before sunset, relieving Greg, who'd covered the previous 3 days. He looked exhausted, mumbled something about a family of bears getting too comfortable near the outhouse, and practically ran to his truck. By 9 p.m., I'd settled in with my coffee, logbooks spread across the desk, the radio crackling softly with the usual chatter from dispatch and other stations scattered across the forest. Around 11:30, the radio static shifted into something else. At first, I thought another ranger was trying to reach me through interference, maybe from behind one of the ridges where signals got choppy, but the transmission wasn't following protocol. No call sign, no station identifier, just fragments of sound bleeding through the white noise. I adjusted the squelch, turned the dial slowly, trying to clean up the signal. What came through made me set down my coffee mug. It sounded like someone crying, muffled and distant, mixed with broken syllables that didn't form complete words. Then, clear as day between the static bursts, I heard it. A whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. My name. Not my call sign or ranger designation, but my first name, Claire, drawn out slow, like someone was tasting each letter. I grabbed the handset immediately, following procedure even though every instinct told me something was wrong. Protocol demanded I check with dispatch first, verify if any search and rescue teams were operating nearby, maybe dealing with an injured hiker or lost camper. Dispatch came through crystal clear, which made their response even more unsettling. Nancy, the night dispatcher I'd known for years, sounded confused when I described the transmissions. She checked her boards, called the other stations, even reached out to the sheriff's department to see if they had any operations running. Nothing. No search teams, no emergency responses, nobody authorized to be on Forest Service frequencies within 50 miles of Pine Ridge. She suggested it might be atmospheric skip, radio waves bouncing off the ionosphere and carrying signals from hundreds of miles away. It happens sometimes in the mountains, but atmospheric skip doesn't whisper your name. I knew that, and from the pause in Nancy's voice before she signed off, she knew it too. She reminded me to lock the cabin doors, keep my sidearm close, and check in every hour. Standard precautions that suddenly felt inadequate when you're sitting alone in a wooden box, surrounded by miles of dark forest. The footsteps started 40 minutes later. Heavy boots on gravel, deliberate and unhurried, circling the cabin like someone taking inventory. I killed the interior lights immediately, moving to the window with my flashlight off, trying to see through the darkness. The security floods should have triggered. The motion sensors were supposed to cover a 30-foot perimeter, but nothing lit up outside. Just the sound of those boots, pausing at each window, each door, sometimes for minutes at a time. At the back door, near the generator shed, the footsteps stopped completely. I heard the doorknob turn slowly, testing. The deadbolt held. Then came a different sound, metal on metal, like someone working a tool against the lock mechanism. My hand found my service weapon, a Glock 22 that suddenly felt too small for whatever was happening outside. The scratching at the lock continued for maybe 2 minutes before the footsteps resumed their circuit, moving toward the front of the cabin where the main entrance faced the access road. I needed to check the power situation, figure out why the security lights had failed. The main breaker panel was mounted on the exterior wall near the generator, which meant going outside. Not an option while someone was out there stalking the perimeter, but I could access the backup battery system from inside, a small closet near the radio desk that housed the emergency power inverter. When I opened the panel door, the LED indicators were all dark, dead. The batteries should have kicked in automatically when the main power dropped, keeping essential systems running for at least 12 hours. I grabbed my flashlight, shielding the beam with my fingers to create just enough light to see. The thick gauge wires that connected the batteries to the inverter had been cut clean through, not chewed by rodents or worn from age, but severed with precision. Someone had been inside the cabin before my shift started, maybe during the day when Greg was out doing his rounds. They'd sabotage the backup power, knowing exactly which wires to cut, understanding our emergency systems better than most rangers did. The radio crackled again, and this time the voice was clearer. A man, speaking in a monotone that made my chest tighten. He recited details about me like reading from a file. My middle name, which wasn't on any of my work documents. The make and model of my personal vehicle parked outside. The fact that I lived alone in a rental duplex on Sycamore Drive back in town, Unit B, with the cracked concrete step I'd been meaning to report to my landlord for months. He knew I jogged the Riverside Trail every morning when I wasn't on duty, usually around 6:30, past the old railroad bridge where the homeless camps used to be. He mentioned the coffee shop where I grabbed breakfast most Sundays, the corner booth I preferred by the window. Then he said something that made me stop breathing for a moment. He described the scar on my left shoulder blade, a jagged line from a climbing accident when I was 19, something you'd only see if you watched me changing clothes. The transmission cut to static before I could respond, leaving me standing in the dark with the severed wires at my feet. My training kicked in through the panic. First priority, establish communication with dispatch. The radio still worked, running on its own battery pack, but I needed to be strategic. If this guy was monitoring the frequency, broadcasting my situation would tell him exactly what I was planning. I switched to the emergency channel, used my personnel code, and kept the message brief. Told Nancy we had a Code 3 situation, potential hostile at Pine Ridge, requesting immediate law enforcement backup. She responded instantly, said units were rolling from town, but it would take them at least 90 minutes to reach my position. 90 minutes. In the city, that's a movie and a half. Out here, alone with someone who'd been studying me for God knows how long, it might as well have been a week. Nancy stayed on the line, her voice steady and professional, but I could hear the tension underneath. She kept asking if I was secure, if I needed medical, if I could provide a description. I told her I was barricaded inside, armed, and couldn't see the subject. What I didn't tell her was that I could hear him again, not walking anymore, but dragging something heavy across the gravel toward the front door. The sound stopped directly outside, followed by a wet splashing noise and the sharp smell of gasoline seeping through the doorframe. My mind raced through the possibilities, none of them good. The cabin was old wood, dry as kindling after months without rain. If he lit it up, I'd have maybe 3 minutes before the whole structure became an inferno. Going out the back meant running blind into the forest where he could be waiting. The windows were too small to squeeze through quickly, designed to keep bears out, not to provide emergency exits. I grabbed the fire extinguisher from the kitchen, knowing it was pathetically inadequate against what was coming. Then I heard the match strike. One single match, the sulfur tang mixing with the gasoline fumes. But instead of the whoosh of flames, there was silence. Then his voice, not through the radio this time, but right outside the door, calm and conversational like we were discussing the weather. He said he'd been watching me for 3 months, learning my patterns, waiting for the perfect opportunity. Tonight was supposed to be simple, he said. But now that the cops were coming, plans had to change. He started talking about other women, other cabins, other nights that ended differently. Jennifer in Washington State, a park volunteer who disappeared 2 years ago. Lisa from Colorado, another solo ranger whose body they found at the bottom of a ravine, ruled an accident. He knew details that never made the news, things only the killer would know. The way Jennifer had tried to radio for help but couldn't get a signal. How Lisa had hidden in the supply closet for 6 hours before he found her. He was building his resume, wanting me to understand exactly who was standing outside my door. Then he mentioned something that changed everything. He said Greg, my colleague who'd worked the previous shift, never made it home. His truck was about 2 miles down the access road, pushed into a gully, with Greg stuffed in the trunk. That family of bears he'd mentioned, the exhaustion, the rush to leave, none of it was real. It was this man, wearing Greg's uniform, standing 3 feet from me in the cabin, close enough that I'd smelled the cigarette smoke on his jacket. He'd handed me the logbook, discussed the weather patterns, acted out a perfect performance, while probably still covered in Greg's blood. The gasoline puddle under the door hadn't been lit. It was a test, he explained, to see if I'd panic and run out the back where he'd set up something special. When I held my position, he knew I was smarter than the others. That made it more interesting, he said. The sheriff's units would arrive eventually, find the cabin intact, me missing, blood somewhere that could be mine, or could be from the deer carcass he'd dragged up from the valley. They'd search for weeks, maybe find some of my gear scattered in different directions, each piece telling a different story about which way I'd gone. He had experience making people disappear in wilderness areas where search grids covered thousands of acres, and scent dogs lost trails at creek crossings. But first, he needed me to come outside voluntarily. The gasoline was just encouragement. What came next would be worse. I heard him walking away from the door, his footsteps heading toward where my truck was parked. The sound of glass breaking told me he was smashing my windows, and then came another splash of gasoline, this time followed immediately by the roar of flames. My truck burning meant no escape route, but it also meant something else. Fire in dry conditions would spread, create smoke visible for miles, bring every available resource running. He'd made a mistake, let his need for psychological torture override his planning. I radioed Nancy with my exact coordinates, told her about the vehicle fire, Greg's probable location, and the confession about the other victims. She was already patching through to state police, FBI, everyone who could move faster than the local sheriffs. Through the window, I watched my truck become a torch, flames reaching up toward the pine canopy. That's when I saw him clearly for the first time, silhouetted against the fire. Tall, maybe 6'2", built like someone who spent time in these mountains, wearing tactical gear that wasn't Forest Service issue. He had a rifle slung over his shoulder, looked like a Remington 700, the kind hunters used for elk. He was focused on the burning truck, seemed to be enjoying the destruction, and that gave me the opening I needed. I moved to the back door, the one he'd tested earlier, slipped the deadbolt as quietly as possible, and eased outside into the darkness behind the cabin. The forest floor was thick with pine needles that muffled my steps as I circled wide, keeping the cabin between us, moving toward the trail that led up to the old fire watchtower a quarter-mile above. If I could reach it, I'd have high ground, better radio signal, and a defensive position until help arrived. But 50 yards from the cabin, I found his trap. Steel cable stretched between trees at ankle height, nearly invisible in the darkness. If I'd run out the back door in panic like he'd expected, I would have hit it at full speed. Further along, I could make out other cables, probably creating a funnel towards something worse. I stepped over carefully, continued up the slope, and that's when I heard him discover I'd left the cabin. His roar of rage echoed through the forest, followed by gunshots, 3 rounds punching through the cabin walls. He was shooting blind, furious that his script had been broken. The sound of helicopter rotors in the distance made him stop. State police, Nancy had said, were already airborne when my call came in, responding to another incident. They'd diverted immediately. The searchlight hit the clearing 30 seconds later, illuminating everything, the burning truck, the cabin, and him, standing in the open with his rifle, looking up at the helicopter like he was calculating odds. He ran. Not toward the forest where he might have evaded capture for days, but straight to the access road, where he must have stashed a vehicle. The helicopter followed, searchlight tracking him through the trees, while I screamed our location into the radio, directing ground units that were now only minutes away. They caught him 2 miles down, trying to ram through a roadblock the sheriffs had set up. Walter Hutchinson, 41, from Idaho originally, wanted in 3 states for similar attacks on women in remote locations. He'd been a wildland firefighter years ago, knew our procedures, our schedules, how we operated alone in these isolated posts. Greg survived, barely. They found him unconscious but breathing, severe head trauma but stable once the medics reached him. The cigarette butts under my cabin window tested positive for DNA linking Walter to 5 other crime scenes. He'd been hunting female rangers and park workers for 6 years, studying us, learning our patterns, picking the ones who worked alone. They found journals in his vehicle, detailed notes about dozens of women, their routines, their vulnerabilities, rating us like we were targets in some sick game. I finished that shift, waited for the sun to come up, gave my statement to what felt like 100 different officers, then drove myself home in a borrowed Forest Service vehicle. Took 3 weeks before I could sleep without checking the locks every hour, 6 weeks before I stopped hearing footsteps that weren't there. The department offered me a transfer to an administrative position, desk work in a nice safe office with security cameras and key card access. I turned it down. Maybe that sounds crazy, but these mountains, this job, they're part of who I am. Walter Hutchinson doesn't get to take that from me. They've changed procedures now, though. Nobody works the remote cabins alone anymore. Always teams of 2. Panic buttons that signal GPS coordinates directly to law enforcement. Infrared cameras that can't be disabled from outside. But sometimes, during those long, quiet nights when I'm back at Pine Ridge with my new partner sleeping in the next room, I still hear it. Not footsteps or voices on the radio, but the sound of someone watching, waiting, learning. Because Walter wasn't the only one out there. During his interrogation, he mentioned others like him. People who'd figured out that rangers in remote posts were perfect targets. We caught one predator, but there are thousands of isolated cabins across the country, thousands of people working alone in places where screaming brings no help. The only difference now is we know they're hunting us, and we're ready. "5 years into being a park ranger, and I thought I'd seen everything the backcountry could throw at me. Bears breaking into supply sheds, hikers getting lost with their GPS still showing full bars, illegal grow operations hidden in the deep ravines. Monday was supposed to be routine maintenance on the old fire road that paralleled Eagle Creek, a section we'd ignored since early summer. My supervisor wanted it cleared before hunting season brought the service trucks through. I remember finishing my second cup of coffee at the station, checking the weather report showing clear skies all week, and loading my chainsaw and brush clearing tools into the truck. The drive out took 40 minutes on winding mountain roads, past the tourist overlooks where families would stop for photos later in the day. At the trailhead, I strapped on my work belt, shouldered my pack with water and emergency supplies, and started the 6-mile hike to where the real work would begin. 2 miles in, right where the trail hooks around this massive chunk of granite that looks like God dropped it there as an afterthought, I saw something that made me pull up short. A wire, thin as fishing line but definitely metal, stretched across the path at shin height. Morning dew had collected on it, creating tiny prisms in the early sunlight. My brain immediately went to poachers, since we'd been dealing with illegal deer snares for months. But when I crouched down for a better look, careful not to touch anything, I realized this was all wrong. The wire connected to a spring mechanism concealed in the undergrowth, attached to what looked like rebar stakes sharpened to wicked points. The whole setup was designed to swing up hard when triggered, and the height was calculated for something walking on 2 legs, not 4. I marked it with orange tape, stepped back carefully, and got on my radio to report what I thought was just some psychopath's idea of a hiking deterrent. Dispatch patched me through to my supervisor, Howard, who told me to document everything and wait for law enforcement. While I waited, I started searching the area more carefully, keeping my eyes peeled for more wires or disturbed ground. 20 feet further up the trail, I found another trap, this one more elaborate. A bent sapling held under tension by a rope system, designed to whip across the path when someone stepped on a concealed pressure plate made from old plywood and springs. The engineering was actually impressive in a terrifying way. Whoever built this understood physics and had access to hardware store materials. But what really made my skin prickle was finding a water bottle tucked behind a tree, still half full, with the condensation on the inside suggesting it had been left recently. The label was torn off, but there was a black X drawn on the cap with permanent marker. Sheriff's deputy showed up about an hour later, a guy named Peterson who I'd worked with on a few search and rescue operations. He took one look at the traps and immediately called for backup in the crime scene unit. While we waited, he asked if I'd noticed anything else unusual in the area lately. That's when I remembered something from the previous week. A hiker had reported finding a backpack off trail near Osprey Point, about 3 miles from where we were standing. The pack had been torn apart, not by animals, but deliberately, with the straps cut and the contents scattered. We'd assumed it was teenagers being destructive, maybe looking for cash or electronics. But Peterson's face changed when I mentioned it, and he got back on his radio, speaking in codes I didn't recognize. When he finished, he told me they'd been tracking someone for the past 2 weeks, a suspect who'd jumped bail on federal weapons charges after threatening a judge. The guy's name was Mason Keller, former Army, trained in what Peterson called irregular warfare tactics. Apparently, Keller had gone off the deep end after losing a custody battle, blamed the entire system, and decided to disappear into the wilderness rather than face prison time. What Peterson didn't tell me, but what I found out later from another deputy, was that Keller had stolen camping equipment, weapons, and enough MREs to last months from an Army surplus store, injuring the owner in the process. The FBI had been tracking him through 3 states, always a step behind. They suspected he was in our park because his ex-brother-in-law had a hunting cabin near the northern boundary, abandoned for years but still standing. Peterson asked me to lead them to the cabin, said I knew these trails better than anyone. I should have said no, should have clocked out and gone home to my empty apartment and my microwave dinner. But I kept thinking about the families who hiked these trails every weekend. Kids who ran ahead of their parents, teenagers who came up here to smoke pot and make out. So I agreed. We formed a small team. Me, Peterson, 2 other deputies, and a park law enforcement officer named Janet, who I'd trained with years ago. Janet brought her tactical vest for me, insisted I wear it, even though it felt like I was playing soldier. As we hiked deeper into the backcountry, we found more evidence of Keller's presence. A tarp strung between trees with military precision, camouflaged so well, I walked right past it twice. Beneath it, empty food cans buried in a pit, the labels burned off. Human waste buried exactly 8 paces from the camp in 4 different directions, marking the cardinal points like some kind of obsessive ritual. Janet found boot prints, size 11, with a distinctive wear pattern on the left heel. She photographed everything while Peterson coordinated with the FBI team that was apparently mobilizing from the city. The strangest thing we found was a journal, wrapped in plastic and hidden in a hollow log. The pages were filled with diagrams of the park trails, patrol schedules he'd somehow obtained, and notes about defensive positions and engagement zones. My name was in there, along with the names of 6 other rangers, our vehicle numbers, our usual routes. He'd been watching us for weeks. Near the abandoned hunting cabin, the traps became more sophisticated and deadly. Pit traps covered with branches and leaves, deep enough to break an ankle or worse. A crossbow bolt rigged to fire when someone opened what looked like an old Forest Service supply box. Peterson's team had to mark and photograph each one, creating a maze of orange tape that made the forest look like a crime scene from hell. The cabin itself sat in a small clearing, surrounded by tall pines that blocked most of the sunlight even at midday. From 50 yards out, it looked deserted, just another relic from when this land allowed hunting leases. The windows were dark, door hanging slightly open, roof thick with pine needles and moss. But Janet noticed something through her binoculars that made us all stop. Fresh scratches on the door frame, about shoulder height like someone had been keeping a tally. She counted them quietly, then looked at Peterson. 43 marks. We'd had exactly 43 missing hiker reports in the past year, though most had been found or returned on their own. Coincidence, maybe, but my gut was telling me otherwise. Peterson called in our position and told us to hold while they brought in a tactical unit. We set up a perimeter, each of us watching a different approach to the cabin. That's when I saw him for the first time, just a glimpse through the trees, maybe 70 yards north of our position. Tall, lean, wearing old woodland camo that blended perfectly with the forest shadows. He was watching us through what looked like hunting binoculars, completely still, like he'd been there the whole time. I whispered to Peterson, pointed to where I'd seen him, but by the time he looked, Keller had vanished. No sound, no movement in the underbrush, nothing. Peterson got on the radio immediately, warning the incoming units that the suspect was mobile and aware of our presence. The FBI helicopter that had been on standby started making passes overhead, using thermal imaging to try to locate him. But Keller knew these woods, had been living in them for weeks, maybe months. He'd prepared for this, and we were walking into his territory on his terms. The tactical unit arrived within 40 minutes, 8 guys in full gear who looked like they'd stepped out of a military recruitment poster. Their leader, a sergeant named Vasquez, took one look at our map of the trapped areas and shook his head. He said clearing the cabin would be like walking through a minefield, except the mines could be anywhere, triggered by anything. They brought in a bomb disposal robot first, one of those tracked units with a camera and mechanical arm. Watching it roll toward the cabin on the monitor they'd set up was surreal, like a video game where the stakes were real bodies and real blood. The robot made it about halfway before triggering something. A log, probably 40 pounds, swung down from the trees on a cable, smashing into the robot hard enough to flip it over. The thing sparked once and died, its camera feed going black. Vasquez cursed in Spanish and ordered everyone back another 20 yards. That's when we heard the whistle. Not a bird, not wind through the trees, but a human whistle, clear and deliberate. The tune was familiar. Took me a second to place it. The army marching cadence, the one about Jody stealing your girl while you're deployed. It was coming from multiple directions, like Keller was moving impossibly fast, or there was more than one person out there. Peterson and Vasquez exchanged a look that told me they were thinking the same thing I was. This guy wanted us to know he was watching, wanted us scared and off balance. The whistling stopped as suddenly as it started, replaced by something worse. A voice amplified through what sounded like a cheap megaphone coming from somewhere behind the cabin. Keller was talking, his voice calm and measured, like he was giving a lecture. He said he'd been expecting us, had been preparing for weeks. Said the cabin was a distraction, that the real show was about to begin. Then he mentioned something that made everyone freeze. He knew about the school group, the 30 middle schoolers on a nature education trip, camping at the group site near Bear Lake, only 2 miles from our position. Vasquez immediately split his team, sending 4 guys sprinting toward Bear Lake while radioing for every available unit to converge on the school campsite. I knew that trail better than anyone. Told Vasquez I could get them there faster using a deer path that cut 40 minutes off the main route. He nodded, assigned 2 of his men to come with me while the rest continued to secure the cabin area. We ran hard, branches tearing at our clothes, jumping fallen logs, sliding down steep sections where the trail was more suggestion than path. About halfway there, we found the first sign that Keller had been this way too. A wallet deliberately placed on a rock in the middle of the trail. The driver's license showed a woman named Carol, 43, from Oregon. One of the teachers had to be. The tactical guys wanted to stop, check for traps, but I kept moving. Every second counted now. We could hear the helicopter circling ahead, and then the radio crackled with news that made me run even harder. They'd found the school group safe, but traumatized. Keller had walked right into their camp at dawn before anyone else was awake, and had a conversation with one of the teachers while she made coffee. Told her about the traps, showed her photos on a digital camera of every single one he'd set, then walked away into the forest like it was just another morning hike. The chase lasted 6 more hours. Keller led us through terrain that would have broken most people, up cliff faces through dense undergrowth that required machetes to pass, across streams swollen with snowmelt. He was always just ahead, leaving signs that he wanted us to follow, pieces of gear, more photos showing traps we hadn't found yet, even a map with locations marked in red X's. The FBI profiler who'd arrived by then said Keller was controlling the narrative, making us play by his rules, exhausting resources while he dictated the terms. But he made one mistake. Near sunset, he crossed through an area where a controlled burn had cleared the undergrowth 2 years prior, leaving nowhere to hide for almost 300 yards. The helicopter spotted him immediately, and this time he had nowhere to disappear to. They tried to talk him down over the loudspeaker, but Keller just stood there in the middle of that burned area, hands at his sides, watching the helicopter circle. When the tactical team closed in from 3 directions, he didn't run, didn't fight, just smiled and put his hands behind his head. They found 14 more trap locations from the map in his pocket, 2 caches of supplies he'd hidden months ago, and a journal detailing his surveillance of park operations going back almost a year. During his interrogation, which I watched parts of later, he said he'd never intended to hurt anyone, just wanted to prove how vulnerable the system was, how easy it would be for someone with actual malicious intent. The traps, he claimed, were all demonstrations, carefully placed where he knew Rangers would find them before civilians did. The prosecutor didn't buy it. Neither did I. Mason Keller got 25 years federal time. No possibility of parole for 15. They cleared every trail in the park twice, found 67 traps total, some so well hidden they needed metal detectors to locate them. The park stayed closed for 3 weeks while they made sure it was safe. When we reopened, attendance was down 70%. Families didn't trust that we'd found everything, and maybe they were right. Sometimes when I'm out checking trails, especially on that old fire road where I found the first wire, I still look twice at every shadow, test the ground before I take a step, and wonder what else might be out there, waiting. Seven summers patrolling Blackwater National Forest, and you develop a sixth sense for when campers are in trouble. Could be the way birds suddenly go quiet, or how the wind carries voices differently when someone's lost. My supervisor used to joke that I collected abandoned gear like some people collect stamps, always hauling back tents and sleeping bags from sites where folks just set up wrong or forgot something. But that July when I found the 4th campsite in 2 months, everything still set up perfect but nobody home, I knew something was deeply wrong. The Coleman stove still had half-cooked beans going cold in the pot, 2 plates set out with forks beside them, and a phone charging on a portable battery. Its screen black but fully powered when I pressed the button. What really got me was the precision of it all. No signs of animal activity, no struggle, no rushed packing. The sleeping bags were unzipped and thrown back like someone just stepped out to use the bathroom. I'd been finding sites like this for years without connecting them, writing them off as unprepared city folks who probably got spooked by something and left their expensive gear behind. But standing there that morning with fog creeping between the Douglas firs and the smell of abandoned breakfast hanging in the damp air, I started mentally cataloging every similar scene I'd documented. The Jacobson couple from Montana in my 2nd year, that college group from California, the solo backpacker with the red beard whose journal I still had in my office, waiting for someone to claim it. That afternoon, I broke protocol and went through the phone at the abandoned site. Most rangers would have bagged it as evidence and sent it up the chain, but after 7 years of bureaucratic dead ends, I needed answers. The owner was a woman named Cheryl Watts, 30-something based on her photos, lots of pictures with what looked like her husband, both wearing matching hiking boots they'd obviously bought special for this trip. Her last call was to 911 at 6:47 that morning. I played it right there in the forest, my skin prickling as her voice echoed through the empty campsite. She was breathing hard, trying to whisper, saying someone was following them, had been following them since dawn, walking parallel through the trees about 50 yards out, never getting closer, never falling behind. The dispatcher kept asking for landmarks, trail markers, anything to pinpoint their location, but Cheryl just kept saying they were on the shortcut between Meadow Loop and Crystal Creek, the one all the locals know about but never made it onto official maps. Then her husband's voice in the background, tight with fear, saying the person was moving closer, that they could see them clearly now, just standing there between 2 big pines, watching. The call cut off after that. No screaming, no sounds of violence, just dead air. I knew that shortcut well, had walked it dozens of times when I needed to move between sections quickly. Unofficial trail, worn down by decades of local use, winding through a stretch of forest so dense that cell service was nearly impossible except for one small clearing about halfway through. I spent the rest of that day in the station's records room, pulling every missing persons report from the past 15 years. My supervisor, Alan, thought I was wasting time, but the pattern was there once you looked for it. Every single disappearance had happened within a 3-mile radius of that unofficial trail. Different months, different years, but always the same area. The really sick part was how spread out they were, sometimes 2 or 3 years between incidents, just long enough that nobody connected them. Different jurisdictions, different search teams, different reports filed away in different boxes. But I had them all spread across the conference table now, and the map I was marking with red pins looked like a constellation of violence, all centered on that hidden path through the woods. By evening, I'd found something that made my chest tight with dread. 3 of the recovered phones had partial recordings or text messages describing the same thing Cheryl had reported. A person following them, staying parallel, moving through the trees with unnatural quiet. One hiker, a kid from Arizona State who vanished in 2011, had managed to send a video to his girlfriend. Grainy, shaking footage of trees and undergrowth, and then, for just 2 seconds, a figure in dark clothing, standing perfectly still about 40 yards away. The face was too distant to make out clearly, but the posture, the way they stood with their weight balanced, ready to move, looked practiced. Like someone who had done this many times before, who knew exactly how far away to stay to keep their prey nervous, but not quite panicked enough to run. I drove out to the shortcut trail as the sun was setting, not sure what I expected to find. The entrance was barely visible from the main path, just a gap between 2 massive cedars that looked like nothing unless you knew where to look. I'd walked maybe a quarter mile in when I found the first one. A hunting blind, old but well-maintained, built into the hollow of a dying oak about 15 feet up. From that position, you could see anyone coming up the trail for about 200 yards, but they'd never see you. The construction was expert, using the tree's natural shape to hide the platform, with branches woven into the supports, so it looked like part of the canopy. Inside, I found water bottles with recent expiration dates, energy bar wrappers, and a pair of binoculars that looked military grade. There were more blinds further down the trail, spaced about 300 yards apart, each one positioned to cover blind spots from the previous one. Someone had created a perfect surveillance network along the entire unofficial path. But the worst discovery came at the 4th blind, where I found a notebook wrapped in plastic. Pages and pages of observations, written in cramped, neat handwriting. Times, dates, descriptions of hikers, details about their gear, their pace, whether they were experienced or amateur. Some entries had check marks next to them. When I cross-referenced the dates with my missing persons files back at the station, every check mark matched a disappearance. The last entry was from 3 days ago, describing Cheryl and her husband in perfect detail, down to the color of their backpack straps. My radio crackled to life, Alan asking for my position. I told him to send everyone he could to the shortcut trail, that I'd found evidence of a serial predator. While waiting for backup, I kept reading through the notebook, trying to understand the pattern. The writer never hunted locals, only outsiders who stumbled onto the unofficial trail by word of mouth or accident. They watched for days sometimes, learning routines, waiting for the perfect moment when the hikers would be in that cellular dead zone. The level of patience was staggering. Some entries tracked the same group for a week before they either left the area or got marked with that checkmark. The handwriting occasionally mentioned the collection point, always in reference to a location deeper in the forest, past where the unofficial trail ended. Sheriff's Department arrived within an hour, along with state police and 2 FBI agents who happened to be working another case nearby. We set up a command post at the trail entrance, and by midnight, we had K9 units working through the forest. The dogs picked up a scent trail from the last blind that led deeper into the wilderness, into an area that technically wasn't even part of the park anymore. Private land that had been sold off decades ago to various buyers. parcels that changed hands so often the county had trouble tracking current ownership. Around 3 in the morning, the dogs led us to an old fire road that hadn't been on any of our maps. Fresh tire tracks in the dirt, deep grooves from a heavy vehicle. The road wound up the mountain for about 2 miles before we found the cabin. It looked abandoned from the outside, just another old hunting lodge left to rot. But the door had a new deadbolt, and the windows, while dirty, were intact and reinforced. We waited for the warrant while keeping the place surrounded. When we finally entered at dawn, the smell hit us first. Chlorine and something else. Something organic and wrong. The main room was set up like some kind of processing station. Industrial plastic sheeting on the floors, commercial-grade freezers along one wall, and a collection of hunting and butchering tools arranged with obsessive precision. But no bodies. The FBI agents found trace evidence, hair and blood that would later match several missing hikers, but whoever lived here had been careful. The back room had surveillance equipment, monitors showing feeds from hidden cameras all along the unofficial trail, some angles I hadn't even found yet. A whole wall covered with photographs of hikers, hundreds of them, some crossed out with red marker. We never found Cheryl and her husband, or any of the others marked with check marks. The cabin's owner was listed as a shell company that led nowhere, registered to a P.O. box that had been closed years ago. Forensics pulled one partial print from the notebook, but it didn't match anyone in the system. For 3 weeks, we had teams combing every inch of that forest, checking every cave, every ravine. State police put up roadblocks, but whoever had been hunting in those woods was gone. They'd probably left the moment I'd called for backup, monitoring our radio channels just like they'd monitored everything else. The unofficial trail is closed now, blocked off with federal warning signs, but locals still report seeing someone out there sometimes walking parallel to the official trails, staying just inside the tree line. Park Service added more rangers, installed cameras, but that whole section of forest still feels wrong, like something terrible soaked into the soil itself. I transferred to a different park the next year, couldn't handle walking those trails anymore, knowing he was probably out there somewhere, maybe watching from some blind we never found, waiting for everyone to forget so he could start hunting again. Everything started with a missing person report that landed on my desk on a humid Monday morning in 2012. I was a park ranger at Whispering Pines National Forest in northern Wisconsin, and missing hikers were part of the job. Most turned up within 12 hours, dehydrated and embarrassed, with stories about taking a wrong turn at some creek or following a deer trail by mistake. But something about this one gnawed at me. The missing hiker, a guy named Paul Simmons, had logged his route with the station, carried a GPS beacon, and had 15 years of backcountry experience. Guys like that don't just vanish. My supervisor wanted me to check Zone 4, the most remote section of the park where Paul had planned to set up camp. I grabbed my gear, kissed my wife Amy goodbye, and headed out before dawn, expecting to find him nursing a broken ankle somewhere off trail. Zone 4 sits about 8 miles from the main ranger station, connected by a service road that floods out every spring and stays muddy well into summer. Only rangers and maintenance crews know about it, which keeps the tourist traffic to zero. I parked my truck near the abandoned fire watchtower and started hiking toward the backcountry sites. The morning air hung thick and still, without even a breeze to move the pine branches overhead. About half a mile in, I spotted fresh drag marks cutting through the underbrush. They started near a fallen log and disappeared into a thick cluster of mountain laurel. The marks were maybe 3 days old, carved deep into the soft earth, with a strange pattern that suggested someone had been pulling something heavy while trying to stay hidden from the trail. I pushed through the laurel branches, following the disturbed ground for about 30 yards, when that familiar sick, sweet smell of decomposition hit me like a physical wall. The shallow grave was barely 2 feet deep, hastily covered with loose dirt and pine needles that had already started to scatter. Paul's body lay face down, his limbs arranged in an unnatural position that made my chest tighten. But what really got me was what was missing. No backpack, no boots, no jacket. Even his thick camping pants were gone. He was left in just his underwear and a torn base layer shirt. The ground around the grave showed no signs of a struggle, no blood spatter on the nearby trees, nothing to indicate he'd fought back. I radioed it in immediately, trying to keep my voice steady while giving coordinates to dispatch. Within an hour, the place was crawling with state police and crime scene techs. I stood back watching them work, but something kept bothering me about the scene. The drag marks didn't lead from any established trail or campsite. They came from deeper in the forest, from an area where nobody should have been camping. While the investigators processed the scene, I couldn't stop thinking about how Paul had been positioned. His arms were crossed over his chest, almost respectfully, like someone had taken time to arrange him after death. Detective Riley, a veteran cop with 20 years under his belt, pulled me aside and asked about other missing hiker cases. I told him we averaged maybe 2 or 3 a year, usually resolved within days. But his question got me thinking. That night, I went home and pulled up our incident database on my laptop while Amy slept beside me. I started cross-referencing missing persons reports with body recovery locations, going back through our digital records from 2008 when they'd switched from paper files. What I found made me get up and pour myself a drink. Over the past 4 years, we'd recovered 7 bodies in the backcountry zones. All hikers, all found in shallow graves, all missing their gear. Every single one had been discovered by a ranger during routine sweeps, never by civilians. The locations weren't random either. They were all near unofficial trails that only park staff used for maintenance access. The next morning, I drove to the records building in town and convinced old Martha, the clerk who'd been there since the 80s, to let me into the basement archives. The paper files went back to 1997, yellowed and smelling of mildew, but meticulously organized. I spent 6 hours down there, photographing pages with my phone, building a timeline that made me increasingly uneasy. The pattern went back further than I'd thought. 15 years of bodies, all found the same way. What scared me most was the precision. The killer knew our patrol schedules, knew which routes we checked and when. He was timing the bodies to be discovered within a specific window, fresh enough that evidence remained, but decomposed enough that immediate pursuit was impossible. I found a map in one of the old files where a previous ranger had marked body recovery sites with red X's. When I overlaid it with our current patrol routes, my mouth went dry. The bodies formed a perfect circle around the ranger station, each one positioned at maximum distance from the others, like someone was marking territory. On Wednesday morning, 3 days after finding Paul, I got a call at 4 a.m. Another body, this time in Zone 7 on the opposite side of the park. Same setup, shallow grave, missing gear, body arranged with care. The victim was a woman named Ruth Chen, reported missing 5 days prior. But here's what made me nearly lose it. She'd been killed after Paul, even though Paul's body was discovered first. The killer had adapted to our discovery, had continued hunting even while police were processing the first scene. Detective Riley met me at the location, and I could see the same realization dawning on his face. We weren't dealing with someone who killed and ran. This was someone who lived here, who knew the forest better than most rangers, who was watching us scramble to understand his game. Riley asked me to list everyone with intimate knowledge of park operations, staff, former employees, local hunters with special permits. The list was shorter than you'd think, maybe 40 names total. But as I wrote them down, I kept thinking about those drag marks, about the strength required to move a body that distance, about the patience needed to wait for exactly the right moment to leave them for us to find. That afternoon, I did something I probably shouldn't have. I went back to Zone 4 alone to Paul's recovery site after the crime scene tape had been removed. I wanted to understand the drag pattern better, to figure out where the killer had come from. I followed the marks backward, deeper into the forest, using my GPS to mark waypoints. After about 300 yards, the marks disappeared at a creek bed. But across the water, I found something that made my skin prickle. A hunting blind, ancient and overgrown, probably from before the area became protected land. Inside were old candy wrappers, fresh ones, the kind sold at the gas station 20 miles away. Someone had been using this spot recently, watching the trails, waiting. Photographed everything and got out of there fast, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. On the drive back, I kept checking my mirrors, paranoid that someone was following me. Amy noticed something was wrong when I got home. I was jumpy, double-checking the locks, closing all the curtains. I couldn't tell her everything. How do you explain that someone might be targeting rangers, using us as unwitting participants in their sick game? The investigation shifted into high gear after the second body. FBI agents arrived from Milwaukee, setting up a mobile command center in the visitors' parking lot. They interviewed every park employee, past and present, ran background checks, analyzed trail camera footage from the past 6 months, but nothing concrete emerged. The killer was too careful, too familiar with our blind spots. Then Detective Riley made a connection that chilled me to the bone. He pulled up weather data for each body discovery. Every single one happened during or just after a heavy rain. The killer was using weather patterns to wash away forensic evidence, while ensuring the bodies would be discovered on schedule, knowing exactly when rangers would need to check for trail washouts and damaged areas. This wasn't just someone who understood the forest. This was someone who understood our emergency response protocols, who knew that rain meant mandatory trail inspections within 48 hours. Riley and I went through the staff duty rosters, comparing them to the discovery dates. My supervisor, Ben Hawkins, had been on duty for 12 of the 15 discoveries. So had I, actually, though I'd only been there for 4 years. The realization that we were both potential suspects made me sick. Friday night, a week after finding Paul, I was working late at the station, going through old personnel files the FBI had requested. The building was empty except for me and the night dispatcher, Eddie, who was half asleep at his desk. Around 11 p.m., I heard something that made me stop typing, the back door to the equipment shed opening. That door was supposed to be locked, only accessible with a ranger keycard. I grabbed my flashlight and walked out to investigate, my heart hammering against my ribs. The shed was dark, but I could smell something odd. Cologne, expensive stuff, completely out of place in a storage area full of chainsaws and hiking equipment. Then I saw him, Ben Hawkins, my supervisor, standing by the rack where we kept confiscated camping gear from illegal sites. He had a backpack in his hands, one I recognized from the evidence photos, Paul Simmons' missing pack. When he saw me, he didn't run or try to explain. He just stood there with this strange, calm expression, like he'd been expecting this moment for years. "You were always too thorough, too smart for your own good," he said, setting the backpack down carefully, almost reverently. Before I could react or call for help, Ben started talking, his voice conversational, like we were discussing trail conditions over coffee. He told me about his first kill back in 1997, a drifter who'd threatened him with a knife near the old mining road. Self-defense, he claimed, but something had awakened in him during that struggle. The thrill of it, the power. He'd spent months planning after that, studying ranger protocols, learning how to hunt humans like they were deer. The hiker's gear? He kept it all in a storage unit in town, trophies from what he called his harvests. He knew every blind spot in our surveillance, every gap in our patrol patterns, because he'd designed half of them himself. The bodies placed in a circle? That was his territory, his hunting ground, marked for any predator who might dare encroach. He'd been selecting victims carefully, experienced hikers who wouldn't go down easy, people whose disappearances would be noticed but not immediately suspicious. He wanted us to find them, wanted the rangers to be the ones to discover his work, because we were the only ones who could appreciate the complexity of what he'd accomplished. As he spoke, I slowly reached for my radio, but he saw the movement and laughed. "Eddie's taking his usual nap and I disabled the emergency frequency an hour ago. It's just you and me now, just like I planned." The strange thing about fear is how it can sharpen your mind while your body wants to shut down. I knew Ben had 40 pounds and 6 inches on me, plus whatever weapon he was concealing, but I also knew the shed layout better than my own house. Every tool placement, every corner, every exit. When he stepped toward me, I grabbed a bear spray canister from the shelf and emptied it directly into his face. The confined space made it worse for both of us, but I was ready for it, already moving toward the door while he screamed and clawed at his eyes. I burst out of the shed gasping and ran straight for my truck, fumbling with the keys as I heard him stumbling behind me, cursing and retching from the spray. I managed to get the engine started just as he reached the parking lot, his face a mess of tears and mucus, rage replacing that calm control he'd maintained for so long. I drove straight to the town police station, not stopping for red lights or stop signs, laying on the horn the entire way. When I stumbled through their doors, covered in bear spray residue and babbling about Ben, they thought I was having a breakdown until Detective Riley showed up and confirmed my story. They arrested Ben at his house 3 hours later, finding the storage unit key in his pocket and enough evidence inside to close 23 missing persons cases across 3 states. Ben never went to trial. 2 weeks after his arrest, while being transferred to a federal facility, the transport van crashed on a remote stretch of highway during a thunderstorm. Both guards survived with minor injuries, but Ben's body was never found. The official report blamed the weather and suggested he'd been thrown from the vehicle into the river below, likely washed downstream. But I know better. I've seen the efficiency of his planning, the patience of his execution. Sometimes late at night when I'm lying awake next to Amy, I think about all those unofficial trails in the forest, all those hidden spots only a ranger would know. The FBI closed the case 6 months later, satisfied that the killings had stopped. And they have, at least in our park. But last month I got an email from a ranger in Wyoming about some hikers going missing near their backcountry zones, bodies found stripped of gear in shallow graves. He wanted to know if we'd experienced anything similar. I deleted the email without responding and submitted my resignation the next day. Amy and I moved to Phoenix, about as far from any national forest as we could get. I work in hotel management now, and I sleep better surrounded by concrete and streetlights than I ever did among the trees. But sometimes I still dream about that circle of bodies around the station, and I wake up wondering if it was really about territory, or if Ben was marking something else entirely, a hunting ground he'd returned to when everyone had forgotten, when new rangers took over who didn't know to look for the signs. Everyone assumes park rangers spend their days rescuing lost hikers and chasing bears away from campsites. But most of my job in 2018 involved driving the same mountain loop road twice a day, checking permits, and making sure nobody left trash at the picnic areas. I'd been working at Ridgeline State Park for about 6 months when they assigned me to the eastern section, a quiet 20-mile stretch that only got maybe 30 visitors on a busy weekend. My supervisor, a guy named Frank who'd been there since the Clinton administration, handed me the route map like he was passing off a grocery list, told me it was the easiest assignment in the whole park. The loop included 3 trailheads, 2 scenic overlooks, and 1 backcountry trail called Moss Creek Path that connected to the larger trail system about 8 miles up. Nothing special about it, just a moderate 2-mile stretch through dense pine forest that most people used as a shortcut between the main trails. My first month on that route was exactly what Frank promised, boring enough that I started bringing audiobooks to pass the time between my morning and afternoon checks. Then October rolled around, peak hiking season, and I got my first missing hiker call on a Saturday afternoon. A woman named Catherine Briggs had gone up Moss Creek Path around noon, for what her husband said would be a quick-hour hike, while he napped in their RV. By 4:30, she hadn't come back. Standard procedure kicked in. We searched until dark, brought in a dog team the next morning, expanded the search grid for 3 days straight. Nothing. No clothing, no water bottle, no sign she'd gone off trail. The dogs tracked her scent about 3/4 of a mile up the path, then lost it completely right in the middle of the trail. not gradually like she'd waded through a stream or gotten picked up by someone in a vehicle, but instantly, like she just vanished between one step and the next. 2 weeks later, it happened again. A college kid named Brandon Torres went up the same trail with his geology class, told his professor he needed to pee, walked ahead around a bend in the trail. His classmates were maybe 2 minutes behind him. When they caught up to where he should have been, Brandon was gone. They found his boot prints in a muddy section exactly where Catherine's scent trail had ended. The prints just stopped mid-stride, right foot forward, left foot never hitting the ground. The search and rescue team brought in helicopters this time, thermal imaging, the whole setup. The lead SAR guy, Tom Garrett, had 20 years of experience finding people in these mountains. He told me privately that in all his time, he'd never seen prints end like that. Not without some explanation like a creek or rock face or something to account for the missing tracks. Frank pulled me aside after the second search wrapped up with no results. Asked if I'd noticed anything unusual on my daily rounds. I told him about the boot prints, about how both missing hikers had vanished at roughly the same spot on the trail. He got this look on his face, not surprised exactly, more like someone had just confirmed something he didn't want to hear. Then he told me to focus on my other duties, said the state police were taking over the investigation. But here's what bothered me. The state police never showed up. I checked with dispatch every day for a week, called my buddy who worked for the state troopers. Nobody had any record of being assigned to our missing hikers. When I brought it up to Frank again, he acted like he'd never told me anything about state police, suggested maybe I'd misunderstood him in all the stress of the searches. I started doing my own research on my days off, spending hours in the county library going through old newspapers on microfilm. What I found made my chest tighten up. November 1973, a family of 4 vanished on Moss Creek Path. August 1981, 2 experienced hikers gone without a trace. September 1989, October 1995, March 2001, June 2009. The list kept going. Always the same trail, always the same section based on the last known sightings, always the same complete absence of evidence. 45 people over 45 years, sometimes in clusters, sometimes years apart, but never more than 8 years between incidents. The older articles mentioned search parties finding footprints that ended abruptly, exactly like Catherine's and Brandon's. One article from 1981 quoted a search and rescue volunteer, saying the tracks looked like the hiker had been plucked off the earth, his exact words. That night I couldn't stop thinking about Tom Garrett, the SAR team leader who'd helped search for Brandon. Tom had worked these mountains longer than anyone except maybe Frank, and the way he'd looked at those prints, like he'd seen them before but didn't want to say it out loud, kept nagging at me. I drove to his house around 9, found him in his garage organizing climbing gear. When I asked him about the other disappearances, he stopped what he was doing, walked over to close the garage door, then pulled out a manila folder from behind his workbench. Inside were photos, dozens of them, all showing footprints that ended mid-step at different spots along the same section of trail. Different shoes, different sizes, different years based on the photo quality, but all stopping impossibly in the middle of the path. Tom said he'd been collecting them for 15 years, ever since he'd responded to his first Moss Creek call. But every time he tried to bring it up with park management, they'd shut him down, tell him he was seeing patterns that weren't there. A week after my talk with Tom, we got another call. A solo backpacker named Douglas Vance, experienced guy in his 50s who'd hiked every trail in the state, had gone up Moss Creek Path early in the morning. His car was still in the parking area at sunset. I volunteered to join the initial search that night, brought my own flashlight and GPS tracker. Tom was there too, and I could see in his face he was thinking the same thing I was. This was going to be another one. Sure enough, we found Douglas's tracks about 3/4 of a mile up, heavy boot treads in the soft earth that just stopped. But this time, I noticed something else. About 20 feet to the left of where the prints ended, there was a game trail I'd never paid attention to before, barely visible through the underbrush. The vegetation looked wrong around it, like it had been carefully arranged to hide the opening rather than growing naturally. Tom saw me looking at the game trail and grabbed my arm, hard enough to hurt. He whispered that we needed to stay on the main path, that going off trail at night was how rangers disappeared too. That stopped me cold because I'd never heard about any rangers going missing. When I pressed him on it, he told me about Carl Brennan, a ranger from 2006 who'd done exactly what I was thinking about doing, gone up to investigate Moss Creek after dark following a disappearance. They found Carl's truck at the trailhead the next morning, his flashlight still on, lying in the middle of the trail, battery nearly dead. No other trace of him ever turned up. The incident got written up as abandonment of post, like Carl had just walked off the job. Tom said there had been 2 others before Carl, one in 1994 and one in 1987, both rangers who'd started asking questions about Moss Creek. Both vanished without explanation. Against Tom's warnings and my own better judgment, I started doing night patrols on my own time. Not official rounds, just me in regular clothes with a headlamp, walking Moss Creek path after my shift ended. The first 3 nights were quiet, just me and the usual forest sounds, owls and small animals moving through the underbrush. On the 4th night, a Wednesday in early November, everything changed. I was about half a mile up the trail when I heard footsteps matching mine, step for step, about 30 yards to my left in the trees. When I stopped, they stopped. When I started walking again, they started, keeping perfect pace. I swung my headlamp toward the sound, but the beam only lit up tree trunks and shadows. The footsteps continued, deliberate and measured, never getting closer or farther away, just maintaining that exact distance. Tried calling out, identifying myself as a ranger, asking if someone needed help. No response, just those steady footsteps when I moved. I made it another quarter mile before I noticed something that made me stop breathing for a second. There were other footsteps now, at least 2 more sets, one on my right side and one behind me, all maintaining that same careful distance, all stopping and starting in perfect synchronization with my movements. They weren't trying to catch me or cut me off, just following, watching, like they were escorting me somewhere. The trail ahead led to the spot where all those footprints had ended, maybe 300 yards away. Every instinct told me to run back to my truck, but I kept going, some stubborn part of me needing to know what was at that spot. As I got closer, I started hearing something else between the footsteps, a low humming sound, not quite human but not mechanical either, coming from multiple directions. My headlamp started flickering. The battery was full when I'd started. I'd checked it twice, but now it was dimming and brightening randomly. When I reached the spot where the footprints always ended, the footsteps around me stopped completely. The silence was worse than the sounds had been, like the entire forest was holding its breath. I swept my failing headlamp around in a full circle and caught a glimpse of something that shouldn't exist. Eyes, at least a dozen pairs, reflecting the light from different heights in the trees. Some 8 feet up, others at ground level, all perfectly still, all watching me. But these weren't animal eyes. They were too large, too forward-facing. And they blinked in unison, all of them at once, like they were connected somehow. Then I saw the shapes between the trees, tall and thin but wrong in their proportions, arms too long, moving in ways that hurt to follow with my eyes. They weren't quite people, but they stood upright, wrapped in what looked like old Park Service uniforms, torn and weathered but still recognizable. One of them stepped forward just enough for me to see its face in the dying beam of my headlamp, and I understood with horrible clarity that I was looking at Carl Brennan, or what Carl Brennan had become after 16 years in these woods. The thing that used to be Carl opened its mouth, and when it spoke, the voice came from all directions at once, from all of them, like they were sharing the same thoughts. It said they'd been watching the trail since before the park existed, selecting people who met certain criteria I couldn't understand. Something about electromagnetic signatures and biorhythms that meant nothing to me but seemed to matter to them. They weren't killing anyone, they were collecting them, changing them, making them part of whatever they were. Carl said they'd been human once, all of them. Hikers and rangers who'd been chosen over the decades, transformed into something that could survive in the spaces between what we see moving through dimensions or planes or whatever they called it. They offered me a choice: join them voluntarily and keep enough of myself to remember who I'd been, or wait until they decided to take me anyway and lose everything. I ran then, sprinted down that trail faster than I'd ever moved in my life, their laughter following me, knowing they could catch me whenever they wanted but letting me go for now. I quit the next morning, walked into Frank's office and handed him my badge and keys without explanation. He didn't ask why, didn't try to convince me to stay, just nodded like he'd been expecting it and pulled out a form he already had filled out with my name and that day's date. As I was leaving, he said something that confirmed every suspicion I'd had about the cover-up. He told me to forget about Moss Creek, said that some things had been happening in these mountains longer than the Park Service existed, longer than the state itself, and the best anyone could do was manage it, keep the numbers low, make sure it didn't get out to the public. The park stayed open because closing it would raise questions, would bring investigators and journalists, would disturb arrangements that had been in place for generations. He said they kept the trail open as a kind of offering, let those things take a few people a year so they wouldn't range further, wouldn't start hunting in the towns at the base of the mountain. I moved 3 states away, took a job in retail, tried to pretend those months at Ridgeline never happened. But last month I saw a news article online about a family that vanished on Moss Creek Path. The Mitchell family, parents and 2 teenage kids, gone without a trace. The article mentioned that search efforts were being coordinated by the head ranger, Frank Coleman, who assured reporters that everything possible was being done. I know better. I know those 4 people are out there in the woods right now, changed into something else, watching the trail, waiting to collect whoever meets their criteria next. I thought about calling the FBI, the media, anyone who might listen, but who would believe me without proof? And going back for proof would mean walking that trail again. Sometimes at night, I dream about those eyes in the trees, all blinking in unison, and I wake up wondering if they're still watching me somehow, if the choice they offered is still on the table, if one day I'll just disappear from my apartment and wake up back in those woods transformed into whatever they are. The truth is, the disappearances will keep happening, have to keep happening, because the alternative is worse, and everyone who knows about it has agreed to let it continue rather than risk what might happen if those things in the woods got hungry enough to leave the trail. That morning slipped in with a kind of quiet that usually makes my shift pretty routine. I worked in a small mountain park on the eastern side of the state. Nothing too dramatic most days, just checking trailheads, clearing fallen branches, and answering the occasional call from hikers who underestimated their stamina. The fog rolled in early, thick enough that the ridgelines looked like they'd been erased with a wide brush. I remember sipping coffee that tasted like metal from the thermos and listening to the radio chatter taper off as visibility dropped. Even with the weather, I felt steady, ready for the kind of day where I'd mostly be tucked in the ranger station doing paperwork. I didn't realize yet that everything was about to hinge on those first radio calls, the ones that sounded just shaky enough to feel real. The voice came through with a scratchy burst, cutting into the weather updates I'd been monitoring. A man, maybe mid-30s by the sound of him, said he was hurt and lost somewhere near a ridgeline we called Pine Spire. He rattled off coordinates that didn't match any common spur trails, but fog confuses people fast, so I didn't question it. I asked for details, injuries, surroundings, anything that would help. He replied like someone trying to breathe through pain, short fragments, little gasps. There was something odd in the tone, not the words themselves, more like he kept glancing away from the radio while talking. Still, the protocol is the protocol, so I logged everything and alerted the closest field team. When the team reached Pine Spire, they called me with that slow, puzzled silence I've only heard a few times in my career. They said the ground was untouched. No disturbed soil, no dragging marks, no broken branches, not even the usual litter from hikers. Fog can hide a lot, but it can't erase footprints from damp soil. Instead, they found a small lean-to tucked behind a cluster of spruce trees. built from mismatched tarps and branches. Nearby were cans of beans with labels peeled off, a fire pit filled with half-burned clothing, and a pile of worn boots in different sizes, none arranged like someone had just removed them. The team waited for a second set of coordinates, but before they even called in, the radio buzzed again. The same voice gave a new location, almost 5 miles east this time, delivered fast, like he was sprinting while talking. I asked how he moved that far while supposedly injured, and he dodged the question completely, jumping straight into asking for help. His tone didn't waver, though. If anything, it got steadier, like he'd rehearsed every line. I passed the coordinates to another unit already patrolling that side of the park. They checked, same result. No injured man, no recent tracks, only another makeshift shelter and a bundle of food wrappers from our own supply stores, the kind we stocked in ranger trucks. I remember staring at the radio, feeling this rising pressure in my chest. Not panic, just the sense that someone was playing a game I hadn't realized I was part of yet. Search teams kept bouncing between points the caller gave, each location scattered across rough terrain, far enough apart that no injured person could realistically travel between them in that amount of time. But every site had its own sign of someone living out there. A tarp stretched between boulders, a rusted coffee can filled with fish bones, even a stack of newspapers that had been clipped into strips, like someone was weaving makeshift rope. It didn't feel abandoned either. Everything looked used recently, arranged by someone who knew how to vanish quickly. Between calls, I tried raising the man to get him to stay put, but he avoided every direct question about landmarks. Instead, he'd mumble about slipping on rocks or trying to follow a creek, always vague enough to keep us guessing. Fog makes radios behave strangely, but this felt too clean, too deliberate, like someone switching channels the exact moment we were close to piecing things together. Around midday, one of the senior rangers, a guy named Leon, stopped by the main station after checking a trailhead. He walked in with his radio held out like it was contaminated. He said he'd picked up a faint signal, same voice, same shaky delivery, but the frequency was slightly off from what we normally used, just enough to hint at someone using equipment to mirror our channel. Leon wasn't the paranoid type, but the look he shot me carried a warning I didn't miss. He told me he'd heard stories in other parks about people using scanners to impersonate officials or distressed hikers, usually to draw resources away from populated areas. He said it low, almost reluctantly, like he didn't want the idea to take root. But it did. It made too much sense. Fog swallowed most of the roads, turning familiar paths into featureless gray lanes. From the station windows, even the nearest trail marker looked like a smudge. With every new call, I felt the pattern solidifying. The caller never repeated a location, never described the shelters we kept finding, and never reacted when we said teams were only minutes away. It dawned on me that he wasn't trying to be found at all. He was trying to keep us away. That thought lingered, sour and heavy. If he needed the Rangers dispersed, he had to be heading somewhere we'd normally be guarding closely. Only one spot fit, the main campground down in the valley where families were packed tight and oblivious to the fog creeping between the trees. I radioed Leon and asked him to swing by the campground just to check if anything seemed out of place. He agreed, but the signal crackled as he pulled away, the fog turning his voice into fragments. While he drove, another call came through from the fake hiker, this time claiming he could hear bears nearby and begging for someone to reach him fast. He even rattled the radio against something hard, trying to mimic panic. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I waited, listening to the static behind his voice. There was a faint whirring sound I hadn't caught before, like a cheap fan or a battery pack humming near the microphone. The kind of noise handheld scanners make when they're not grounded properly. It felt like the last puzzle piece clicking into place. Leon checked in a few minutes later, sounding strained. He said the campground seemed quiet at first, kids playing near the fire pits, a couple arguing while setting up a tent, normal weekend stuff. But then he noticed that one of the supply sheds behind the ranger kiosk had its padlock pried open, the metal bent like someone had worked on it for a while. Inside, the shelves were ransacked. First aid kits, propane canisters, non-perishable food, all gone. Even the emergency radio batteries had been stripped out of their cases. Leon said there were muddy impressions on the ground nearby, not footprints exactly. More like someone had dragged burlap sacks or heavy fabric across the dirt to avoid leaving clear tracks. Hearing that made my scalp tighten. Whoever had been calling us wasn't wandering aimlessly. They were gearing up, gathering what they needed while we chased ghosts in the fog. I told Leon to hold position and keep eyes on the main loops while I notified the rest of the team. Before I could finish the message, the fake caller broke in again, louder this time, practically shouting coordinates. But he slipped. He said, "Nobody's around, it's safe," and then cut himself off like he realized he'd said too much. Safe for who? I muted my mic, steadying myself, and replayed his words in my head. If he thought no rangers were nearby, then maybe he was close to the campground, expecting us to be miles away searching for him. That meant he was watching, waiting for an opening, maybe preparing to raid the full storage area or worse. Try something with the campers who didn't know any of this was happening. The fog probably emboldened him. Sound doesn't travel right in it, and visibility can shrink to 10 yards in seconds. I ran out to the truck and cut through the service road, moving slow so I wouldn't go off the edge. The air outside tasted like cold stone, and branches hung low under the moisture. When I got closer to the campground, I parked and continued on foot, keeping to the tree line. I saw Leon near the kiosk, trying to look casual while watching the picnic tables. Families were still out, completely unaware. Then I caught movement behind the shed, a hunched figure slipping between the trees, wrapped in layers of mismatched clothing, carrying something bulky against their chest. Not a camper, not lost. The person kept glancing toward the valley, maybe listening for engines, maybe checking if the fog was thinning. As I stepped closer, my radio crackled again with that same fake distress call, coming from the direction of the figure. He was broadcasting live while scouting the campground, hoping we'd still be chasing his decoys. Instead of rushing him, I signaled Leon and circled wide to cut off any escape route. The figure ducked behind a stump, then bolted toward the maintenance road when he realized we'd zeroed in on him. He dropped a few items along the way, a stripped radio battery, a jar of peanut butter from our supply shed, even a torn map marked with several circles that matched the fake coordinates he'd given all day. Leon intercepted him first, tackling him hard enough to send the stolen gear scattering over the gravel. When we pulled the mask from his face, he looked younger than I expected, maybe late 20s, with eyes darting so fast they didn't land on anything. He kept mumbling about needing supplies, about people filling the woods, about how he thought we'd stay busy long enough for him to grab everything he needed. The sheriff's office took him shortly after, and once the fog finally thinned, the whole campground learned how close they'd come to being part of a different story entirely. I still think about that day whenever the fog settles thick, and the radio hisses unpredictably, how a simple voice on the line nearly turned into something much worse. Most mornings on duty started the same way for me back then. Coffee from the visitor center, quick radio check, and a quiet moment on the back porch overlooking the tree line, while the air still carried that chilled, earthy smell before the sun heated everything up. I'd been working seasonal shifts for a few years. Nothing glamorous, just long days of trail maintenance, assisting lost hikers and keeping an eye out for the usual wildlife issues. That specific morning stood out, though, because the radio chatter was unusually dense for such an early hour. Reports were coming in from different directions about a man hiding in the brush near several trails. The thing that grabbed my attention wasn't the fact that he was shirtless. It was how hikers kept describing him as unbelievably thin, darting around with unnatural speed, and refusing to say a single word when approached. I remember standing there with my thermos halfway to my mouth, while listening to one of the callers who sounded shaken enough that his voice hitched every few words. He talked about seeing a man crouched behind a fallen log like he was waiting for something, his ribs showing even from a distance. Another report mentioned how the man moved the moment he was noticed, slipping deeper into the brush like he'd rehearsed the escape 1,000 times. My supervisor asked me to check the north sector first, and I headed out with that low tension in my chest. Nothing dramatic, just the kind of buzzing awareness you get when you're walking into something you can't quite define yet, but you know isn't normal. By early afternoon, the situation escalated when a backpacker came stumbling onto the service road, injured, breathing hard like he'd sprinted half a mile. I remember the torn strap on his pack and the dirt smeared across his shoulder as he tried to explain what happened. He managed to get out that someone had rushed him from behind, grabbed at his gear, and tried pulling him toward the brush. He never saw a full face, only tangled hair, gaunt arms, and a sudden strength that didn't match the man's skeletal appearance. Once he broke free, he ran without looking back. The moment he mentioned the attacker's unusual speed, something clicked. This wasn't some lost hiker having a breakdown. Whoever it was had been watching people long enough to learn when to strike. I followed the direction the backpacker had come from and found signs that didn't sit right. Branches bent at odd angles, impressions in the dirt that looked more like someone using their hands than their feet to anchor themselves, and long drag marks leading off trail. A few minutes deeper in, I spotted the torn fabric from the backpacker's strap snagged on a thorny bush, proof that the attacker hadn't just bumped into him but intentionally tried to pull him off the main path. I radioed it in and kept pushing forward, slower this time, noticing how the forest seemed untouched by regular foot traffic. The deeper I went, the quieter everything became, almost as if the usual sounds had thinned out with the light filtering through the canopy. It felt like stepping into a part of the forest that didn't want to be disturbed. Maybe an hour into tracking those strange signs, I reached a boundary most hikers never even knew existed. A rusted chain strung between two warped posts marking the start of a restricted zone used decades ago for emergency training. The place hadn't been maintained in years, so the forest had reclaimed it almost completely. Thick vines wrapped around old metal fixtures, and the soil felt softer, like no one had stepped there in ages. Still, something about the pattern of disturbances on the ground told me someone had been using this forgotten patch of land regularly. A few snapped twigs formed a faint path that curved deeper, and I followed it cautiously, pushing aside the underbrush piece by piece until the smell of damp wood and something faintly sour hung in the air. Eventually, I reached a small clearing where an old survivalist-style shelter sat partially hidden under branches someone had deliberately layered over the roof. The structure wasn't large, maybe big enough for one person to sleep and sit inside, but it looked lived in. The doorway was draped with a tarp so aged that the edges had frayed into thin strands. I remember pausing for a long moment before lifting it, half expecting someone to lunge out. Instead, the space inside was empty, but cluttered in a way that told a long story. Food wrappers stacked neatly in a corner, a makeshift stove built from an old metal canister, and maps spread across a crate. One map in particular caught my eye, my own patrol route circled in red, updated with markings that only someone who'd watched for weeks could have pieced together. Next to the maps lay something that unsettled me more than the idea of being watched. A weathered journal with a cracked spine, pages swollen from moisture. I flipped through it with slow hands, reading entries about long shifts, arguments with supervisors, and a growing resentment toward outsiders intruding on the land. The handwriting grew messier the further I went, sentences turning disjointed, references to hearing voices in the trees or sensing patterns in the rustling leaves. One entry mentioned a resignation after a collapse that happened during a storm. That date matched a personnel file I vaguely remembered hearing about years before, someone who used to work seasonally around here and never fully recovered from a breakdown. I realized then that the journal wasn't some scattered relic. It belonged to the person described in those emergency orientations, the one who'd walked away and simply never returned. While processing all of this, I spotted a pile of torn clothing hidden beneath a slab of bark. Some pieces looked sun-bleached, others dirty and stiff with mud. Among them were fragments of gear that matched descriptions from missing persons cases that had circulated quietly among staff for years. Those cases had always felt disconnected, a hiker who vanished without a trace, a camper who never made it back to their site, but the locations had all hovered around this general sector. Standing there, the weight of it sank in. Whoever had lived in this shelter didn't just know the forest better than anyone. They had shaped their entire existence around avoiding human contact while watching everything that moved. This wasn't a ghost story or some legend passed around campfires. It was a person who had let isolation reshape them into something unpredictable. I stepped away from the shelter to radio in the findings, but before I even reached for the device, a branch snapped from somewhere to my right. Sharp, intentional, too close to be wildlife. I didn't see anyone, but the feeling of being observed tightened around me like a net. The silence had a weight to it now, as if the trees were holding their breath. I spoke calmly into the radio, giving my location and requesting backup, choosing my words carefully so I wouldn't spark panic. While I waited, I kept scanning the tree line, watching for the slightest twitch of movement. At one point, I spotted a smudge of dirt on a rock that hadn't been there minutes earlier. It was enough to tell me he knew exactly where I was and had probably been watching since the moment I crossed into the restricted zone. 2 other rangers eventually arrived, and we secured the area as best we could before sweeping outward with measured steps. It didn't take long to find more signs that someone had been circling us. Fresh impressions in the soil, scraps of leaves that looked recently disturbed, and an odd pattern of stones arranged behind a fallen log. Whoever this former employee had become, he wasn't surviving by luck. He moved with purpose, using every inch of the terrain like it was an extension of his own body. We followed the trail as far as we safely could, but the track slipped into a slope that ended in dense growth we couldn't push through without risking injury. Eventually, our supervisor called off the pursuit, deciding we'd already pushed our luck far enough without visual confirmation of the suspect. Over the next few weeks, patrols were doubled, trail cameras were installed, and certain areas were temporarily closed. Footage from one camera showed something that still unsettles me: a figure passing through the edge of the frame, moving so quickly that only one clear detail registered: a shock of dark, tangled hair swaying behind him. No shirt, no gear, no hesitation. He kept his head angled downward, his posture low, almost animal-like. When we tried to track him after that, he was always one step ahead, leaving faint evidence that he'd been there but never giving us a direct encounter. The missing persons cases from previous years were re-examined, and the cluster of disappearances around that sector suddenly made grim sense. It was clear he hadn't just stayed in the forest all this time. He'd adapted to it in ways none of us were prepared for. The park eventually implemented a formal protocol, identifying him not as a rumor, not as some local myth, but as a real human threat. Unpredictable, potentially violent, and intimately familiar with the terrain. The shelter was dismantled, the journal stored as evidence, and search teams combed the area at intervals. But we never found him again. Every so often, a hiker reports seeing someone darting between the trees, or hearing footsteps where no one should be. Each time the description is the same: extremely thin, fast, filthy, silent. Nothing mystical, nothing supernatural. Just a man who walked away from society and let the wilderness carve a new version of him. I still patrol the park today, and whenever I pass that old restricted zone, I can't help but wonder if he's somewhere nearby, watching with the same quiet intensity that started this whole mess.